On this episode, I am discussing NVIS, or Near Vertical Incident Skywave Propagation, and a training item on establishing your family emergency communication and reunification plan. This is the Field Radio Podcast. I'm your host, John Jacobs, W7DBO, Whiskey 7, Delta Bravo Oscar. Thank you for clicking and tuning in and joining us on this podcast. In the way of news, I got the honor to be on the Ham Radio Now show last week with David Goldenberg. David has been on the show twice discussing field portable operations and emergency communication support. On his show, we discussed the building of Go Boxes, the Field Radio Podcast, and took off in several other directions discussing all things ham related. I will link in the show notes of the video that is on YouTube, and the audio is also posted in podcast format. The clock is ticking and 4 weeks to go until Dayton Hamvention in Xenia, Ohio. I'm excited to get back there and this year be free to move around and capture as much as I can and bring it back to you. The Dayton Committee announced a product showcase for the media where vendors have a few minutes to demonstrate new product lineups. Each one of these will be recorded for YouTube and also published in audio-only format. The plan is my father, Larry, WA7ZBO, and I will fly out Wednesday and be on the ground all day Thursday for setup through Saturday. As far as scheduling goes, there will be one more podcast release before Dayton. Then the week of Dayton, there will be nightly wrap-up shows Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. Then the following week or so, all the other video files will be released. If you would like to support the Dayton broadcast, there will be more information on the website at fieldradiopodcast.org. The topic of this show this week is NVIS. I have been working the past month on some field experiments with NVIS and wanted to go into depth on this episode. There is no guest for this topic, so I'll break down NVIS and practical applications of this theory. I hope you enjoy. In conversations, you will hear reference to a NVIS antenna when actually NVIS is a propagation mode that can be leveraged with almost any type of antenna. NVIS, spelled phonetically November, Victor, India, Sierra, stands for Near Vertical Incident Skywave. NVIS is a propagation mode which uses high-angle radiation to send your signals almost straight up into the air to be reflected back to Earth. An easy, simplistic way to think about this is the effect when you spray water out of a hose straight up in the air. The water forms an umbrella of water and comes back down in a circular pattern. Typical transmission power is upwards to 100 watts and 50 watts for digital modes, as you would expect with typical operation. Depending on the band conditions, the D layer in the day can eat up a bunch of the signal, and an amplifier may be needed to break through the noise during the day. Now compare NVIS to long path propagation that you would typically use when you desire DX or distance contacts. You configure your antenna to have as low takeoff angle as possible to get the right bounce off the ionosphere to achieve around-the-world contacts. This type of setup will produce what is called the skip zone. This skip zone is between your longest ground path and your shortest skywave distance. So this is where NVIS propagation has value. You can make contact more easily with the stations in this skip zone. This is beneficial in emergency communications because you desire to make a contact with a close city, possibly an EOC, and not logging that rare DX contact in the South Pacific. The military has long used NVIS for short and medium range contacts in the field. For emergency communications, or EMCOM, the NVIS is beneficial also because the setup is fairly easy, can be done by one person, and only requires a 16-foot mast. The only downside is you will need a 45-foot by 45-foot space to set up this antenna, but that can be easily overcome in the grass area of a park or a clearing in the field. So let's take a look more at the specifics of frequency and propagation. NVIS only works from the 2 MHz to 10 MHz band, depending on band conditions and time of day. The concept is that the signal will penetrate the D layer of the ionosphere and bounce off the F layer. The reason for the 2 MHz to 10 MHz range is anything lower than 2 MHz will not penetrate the D layer, and anything higher in frequency will not bounce off the F layer but penetrate into space due to the high takeoff angle. So for amateur radio operation, we are looking at the 40, 60, 75, and 80 meter bands. Below 10 megahertz, you can make reliable communications at the range of 600 miles or less. Since we are using the 40 through 80 band, a properly configured dipole can provide effective communications 24 hours a day, utilizing 40 meter band during the day and 80 meter band during the night. The reason for moving down the dial through the night is with the weakening of the F layer at night, the 40 meter signal that worked during the day now penetrates into space instead of being reflected back down to Earth. The ideal antenna for NVIS is a dipole low to the ground. Now, a dipole at a half wavelength above the ground exhibits directionality and low takeoff angle, which is desired for DX. However, if you take that same dipole and position a quarter of the wavelength above the ground to 1/10 of the wavelength above the ground, you get not only the high takeoff angle needed for NVIS, but also an omnidirectional pattern which is desired for this mode of operation. Now, because the wire is now so close to the ground, that same dipole that was up high in the air will now need to be tuned as well due to the ground effect on the antenna. So you'll need to shorten up your lines a bit to get back into a resonant frequency. There is some debate on the best configuration of the dipole. Some will say that a flat top horizontal dipole produces best results, where the ends and middle are all at a quarter wavelength or less above the ground. Others, like me, believe that a slightly inverted V configuration is best. I think half the reason why I believe the slight inverted V produces the best results is it is more field expedient to set up and requires less gear. Several years ago, I decided to finally make my own dipole configured for NVIS. DX Engineering has a great document that I have sourced for this episode. They also have all the information and parts needed to build your own antenna. I like the configuration they have with essentially a pole in the middle raising 15 feet high and the 40 meter dipole extending one direction and the 80 meter dipole extending 90 degrees off of the 40. So if you can picture it, especially here on Audioland, you will have 4 wires extending away in an X pattern if you're looking down on the configuration. 2 wires for the 40 meter and 2 wires for the 80 meter. Now, this setup also makes life easy because now you essentially have 4 guy wires holding up your mast. So no other guying is needed. And since you are only 15 feet off the ground, there is very little risk of putting this up in a park or a field as long as you have the space for the wires. Now, for the center mass, I used 4 4-foot military-type canvas poles. These come in fiberglass or metal and is sold at surplus stores as camouflage netting poles, but we as hams know they're better known as portable antenna masts. We don't tell them that, or they would triple the cost at the store. Sometimes they sell them with fiberglass ring used to spread the camouflage netting at the top. However, if you turn the whole pole system upside down, this top piece now becomes a nice bottom piece to keep the mast from sinking into the ground if you are in loose sand. Typically, for higher masts, I will use metal poles, then switch to fiberglass 2 sections before the top of the mast. However, since there is little to no load on the mast, all fiberglass works great for this setup. Now, 4 of these poles put you at 16 feet. So I just put my plastic center tee that connects the wires to the coax a foot down on one of the poles, using some pipe clamps. You can also drill some bolts through the mast to secure the T-point. You can make your tee on a 3D printer or use common PVC pipe, or DX Engineering has a nice one I used. In the instructions I will include in the show notes, DX will give you a bill of materials you can order from them minus the mast to assemble your own. So getting back to the build, for 40 meter side, you will need 2 25-foot sections of wire, then attached to the ends of the wire, a rope 20 foot long. On the 80 meter side, you will need 2 wires at 38 feet with an attached rope at 7 feet in length on each end. Between the combination of the wire and the rope on both bands, you will equal 45 feet in total length being secured by some tent stakes. The 40 meter band having almost equal wire and rope, and the 80 meter band having very little rope. If you did not add extra rope to the 40 meter side, it would come down at a sharper angle to the earth than desired for NVIS. 45 feet of line and rope puts the wire at the sweet spot angle of a slightly inverted V dipole. Now you will want to, of course, cut the wire a bit long, Then dial back the wire as you tune it up. There's an old saying, easier to remove wire than watering it and hoping new wire will grow. So from your T, you have the 4 lines connected, 2 to each side of your coax connector. At this point, I introduced a 1-to-1 balun to get the right impedance on the line. I use 100 feet of RG8X to bring the line back to the radio. You have to remember that 15 feet is taken up in the pole vertical and 45 feet getting away from the antenna array. So with a 100-foot coax, you will now have 40 feet to get to your station. So I've described the typical NVIS antenna, an inverted V dipole raised at 15 feet at center and several feet at the base. Another configuration I've used is my buddy pole configured for NVIS. The setup is same, however, it can use a much smaller footprint because of leveraging of the buddy pole system. The tripod is at 15 feet, then several poles going horizontal to the coils. From the coils, anywhere from 14 to 28 feet of wire is played out from the coils and sloping downwards. The coils are also tapped differently based on the band. Buddy Pole recommends the end wires be secured with non-conductive fence posts holding the ends 2 feet off the ground. See, this is where it comes back that Buddy Pole is also recommending a slightly inverted V configuration. This provides a very efficient, versatile setup in a much smaller footprint than your typical NVIS type configuration. Now with the Buddy Pole, I did use the balun in the 1-to-1 setting, and I have included in the show notes the Buddy Pole white paper on this setup. After talking to Chris of Buddy Pole at Hamcation in February, he mentioned tests being conducted on very low to the ground NVIS setup. Remember when I talked about in the beginning, the height is either 1/4 wavelength to 1/10 of the wavelength. I decided to give this a try and will soon publish some videos on my experiment. To run my very non-scientific test, I use WhisperNet to map my propagation. I first tested at my home using my Comet Vertical installed on the roof of my house to mimic an omnidirectional typical pattern. I ran transmit only for 16 minutes at low power and noted my results. As expected, I had DX results and results east and west coast from my home in Utah. Then I moved down the road a 1/4 mile to a park for my Buddy Pole setup. I set up the traditional height of 15 feet and sloping down to 2 feet. I then ran WhisperNet in transmit only for 16 minutes at very low power on 40 meter, since this was during the day. True to form, my far-reaching DX stations were not there, and my furthest contact was a little bit beyond Midwest. So being in NVIS, it did pull my reach, but also brought in closer stations I did not observe at home. Then I took the Buddy Pole, mounted it to a small photo tripod a foot off the ground. I had to 3D print a part so I could mount the Versity to this tripod. Then extended the lines at 1 foot mark out to my fence posts, so this would be a horizontal dipole. I then ran the test again, being only 1 foot off the ground. Once again, my circle of stations heard now moved in even closer, and I picked up 2 more stations that was not heard before, that was close. So from my very unscientific results, I found that lowering the antenna to a very low off the ground did produce a smaller circle of contacts. Now I have to put a big disclaimer on this. WhisperNet is based on other stations that may be band hopping or transmitting on irregular schedules. To mitigate this, I did run for 16 minutes continuous, hoping to get a good sampling of stations hearing me. I did not listen because those other stations most likely were not NVIS setup, and it would cloud my results on the map. My next experiment, I want to try my traditional antenna and the Buddy Pole antenna low to the ground, and also test phone with other stations within my typical skip zone configured to NVIS to determine if lowering to the ground is beneficial. A couple items I have done to my stock antenna for NVIS. First, based on my conversation with Paul Calley, WOYR, formerly KB7VML, that was on the show, I'm going to add 60-meter line to the array. So now instead of 4 lines forming an X, I'm going to have 6 lines forming a star, adding a 60-meter option without having to take the time to trim my 80-meter line up. I'll be interested to see how this reacts with the other lines. Another optional addition I've also done is you can install some J-hooks to use as line winders on your pole. The J-hooks I used are open-ended conduit braces found at the electrical aisle of hardware stores. You install 2 J-hooks opposite of each other on the final pole next to the T by drilling through the pole. Then put the other 2 J-hooks at the bottom of the same pole. That gives you some winding points to wind up the wire and rope and keeps everything very nice and organized on the pole. Then use some Velcro ties to hold the line wound around the J-hooks. Nothing is worse than pulling out a 4-wire tangled antenna out of your pole bag. Items to add in your kit is also fluorescent line marking tape. I use this at several points in the line to warn the public or myself to not walk right through the lines. Also at the military surplus store, they do sell a pole bag that works quite well to store all of these military 4-foot poles. So wrapping this up, I encourage you to look at NVIS not only for emergency communications, but also for state QSO parties, where you gain more points for in-state contacts than out-of-state. I'm also organizing Utah's state QSO party, Utah Parks on the Air, in late August, where something like an NVIS in a city park will produce amazing results for in-state contacts. If you are interested in participating in this state QSO party, you can find out more information at utpota.org. I'm also going to set up the NVIS on Field Day, hoping others in the western states have done so also to pick up some stations in the skip zone. In the show notes are some good links to read in greater detail about NVIS. I have avoided some of the most controversial points that you can find about NVIS in the QRZ forums for entertainment. Finally, the NVIS setup of an antenna is a very cost-effective option. It's very easy to build and a great starter project for your first antenna build, and it also increases your capabilities in your emergency communication deployment package. For the training item, I got an email this week from Jesse Ling asking about how to organize a family communication plan and also best practices on organizing channels on your radio. So this episode, I will cover the family emergency plan, and next episode, I will cover some best practices on organizing the programming of your radios. If you have a topic or question you would like to see covered on the show or a training item, drop me a line at John, that's John, at fieldradiopodcast.org. Hello, this is John W7DBO with the training item. One of the first items when starting to get your family prepared for an emergency is to establish a family emergency communication plan or a family reunification plan. This sometimes gets overlooked in the excitement to start purchasing items for your 72-hour or now your 120-hour emergency kit. As with all of our emergency preparations, we need to keep in mind that we prepare not just for regional emergencies or disasters, but also the small personal emergencies in life. The goal of the Family Emergency Communication Plan is to 1. Gain information and intelligence on the emergency and the location of family members, 2. Establish communication with your family members, and lastly 3. Reunification with your family. This training item will discuss these 3 goals. In the event of emergency, we will want to have a general understanding of the whereabouts of our family's last known location. Here are some items to consider to accomplishing this task before the emergency. Keep the shared family calendar and shared work calendars current with activities. Even if the data networks go down, your phone will have cached your calendar and shared calendar's last good configuration. You can then reference the offline data stored in your phone, or if your networks are still up, live data, to see where your family members were scheduled to be at that time. And inverse, your family can see where you were scheduled to be located last. Also, some location finding apps for phones store offline last known good location. The first step in reunification is having an accurate picture of last known locations. The other intelligence we need to gather is the extent of the emergency and other related information. This can be accomplished in several different ways. The traditional method is to have a TV with over-the-air signal capability, a radio that can receive the emergency alert system, and a radio that can tune to local FM broadcasts. The last 2 can be solved with your handheld if it has FM radio capability built in. Along with the channels on your HT, your local hams on repeaters or simplex frequencies can provide boots-on-the-ground observations. Newer forms of emergency alerts include getting notifications on your phone automatically from dispatch centers based on cell tower proximity, You can also subscribe to local reverse 911 system for not only your home, but your work location, city or county emergency subscriber lists for home or work, apps on your phone from local media, and apps from transportation departments or other government sources. Lastly, in grid-up situations, Twitter will provide you real-time information faster than official channels can provide. After you've gained intelligence and information, you need to enact your plan to gain health and welfare information on your family and establish communications. Be sure to have all of your phones updated with all possible contact information. In spotty data coverage, now is not the time to query Google Maps or web searches for school or work phone numbers or addresses. Have all possible information stored in your phone, including alternate phone numbers, addresses, such as local hospitals, fire, and police stations. For example, if you know your son is at a friend's house and you cannot get there, you will need the exact address if you expect a local ham in the area to make a welfare check for you. Lastly, if you have the storage room on your phone, instruct Google Maps app to store local map data offline. Make a laminated card with critical contact information on one side in case your cell phone loses power and you lose the ability to query the phone. Once again, you may get aid from a ham outside the disaster area that can make phone calls for you. Additional phone number to have is a designated point of contact well outside the possible affected area, possibly in another state. Give each family member instructions on the card to attempt to send a text message to this person, since text is more likely to get through than a call. The person outside the area can gather the information and relay back as needed. In complete grid down situations, you can utilize local ham operators to pass national message traffic, or if you have the capability, you yourself can use the HF bands to relay message information to out-of-state contacts, or utilize the HF WinLink system. Provide each family member a radio to store in their daily bag. Also have one installed or available in every vehicle and one in the home as well that your family knows how to use. Have programmed in a simplex frequency and instruct your family members to have this radio turned on and monitoring in the event of emergency. Make sure these instructions are also included in the radio bag and your emergency contact card information. You will be able to use this simplex frequency to establish communications with your family. Once again, if you are not in simplex range, you may be able to get a local ham operator to change frequency and make the call and relay information for you. After you have information, intelligence, and re-established communications with your family, the last step is reunification. If you are in contact with your family, you can make the decision then when and where to meet based on the circumstances. If you are not in communication, you need to have a written instructions on where to go for reunification. For your children who are minors, the instruction should be simply stay in last known location. If we know where you were last, we are coming for you, or sending someone to get you. If you wander or leave, then we will have no information where you are. So if it is safe to stay where you are, they should do so. Establish a safe word in advance so they know the person sent to get them comes from you. Having an established family safe word is a good practice to follow in everyday circumstances. For adults, if it is safe to travel, move to the closest predetermined safe house location. If you are commuting, this may be perhaps returning back to work if that's closer, or continuing home, or to another friend or family member's home. If your family knows your last location, they can make an educated guess you are staying put or moving to a predetermined location. Lastly, your family communication card has numbers on one side. Use the other side for a current family photo. You may need this photo to prove relationship at a government reunification center or to query people of the whereabouts of a family member in a search situation. This emergency communication and reunification plan should not be overlooked in establishing and maintaining along with your physical items for preparedness. We as emergency communicators are prepared to offer our unique services to our community and served agencies in the event of a disaster or emergency. However, we will not be able to perform our duties if our family and loved ones' health and welfare is not secured. This is John W7DBO with the Training Item. This will do it for this episode. Thank you for listening. As always, please send me your comments, feedback, and show ideas to john@fieldradiopodcast.org. One topic I am on the hunt for is a meteorologist to come on the show and educate us on understanding weather forecasts and reading changing cloud conditions, since we like to put up lightning rods, also known as antennas, in the field. If you have a contact or are a meteorologist or very acute in this field of study, please drop me a line. I would love to get some expertise on this topic. Until next time, 73.